Thank you very much, Jen. Now it is my pleasure and great honor to introduce Dr. Nancy Ascher. She is an organ transplant surgeon and the chair of the Department of Surgery at the University of California, San Francisco, past president of the Transplantation Society and member of the WHO Task Force on Organ Donation and Transplantation to combat organ trafficking. She is also the first woman in the world to ever perform a liver transplant. So, Dr. Ascher, please.
Good morning. So, I'm sorry I'm not a judge or a prosecutor. I can assure you that if anyone gets sick on this plane, either I or Elmi can take care of you, so you should be rest assured for that. But my job today is to, can I have my first slide, please? My job today is to give you some context about organ trafficking. I know that you spend a lot of time thinking about people trafficking, prostitution, labor trafficking, but this is a little bit different. It's a much smaller piece of the pie, but a really important piece of the pie. So I want to talk about the Sustainable Development Goals and really get down to what we're talking about with global burden of disease. What is it all about that we have to worry? What's the role of transplant in the global burden of disease? And what's the potential for exploitation? Then I think Elmi, my colleague, will talk more about the specific exploitation. So health isn't concentrated in a single country. It's all over. It's something that we all throughout the world have to think about. And it is never more important than when we think about organ trafficking in the sense that what happens in your country or what happens in my country affects your country. So here are the Sustainable Development Goals that were pronounced in 2015 with the notion that they would be done by 2030. And of course, this is an incredible, lofty goal in and of itself. But you can see that number 3 is good health and well-being, with the notion of some type of universal health care, a basic minimum amount of health care for people. And that's, of course, what we are all interested in. The idea of national self-sufficiency is something that you have to think about when you think about organ trafficking. The notion is that every single country figure out what the burden of disease is. In the case of transplant, it's figuring out what the needs are of patients with end-stage organ failure, develop adequate health providers, educate these providers, physicians, surgeons, nurses, hospital resources, meet the needs of transplant with either deceased donors or live donors, develop an infrastructure to enable this process, and finally to develop registries so we can figure out who's waiting for an organ, who's given an organ, so that we can actually monitor what's going on in every single country. And I frequently am asked to give advice to different government officials, ministries of health, as to what the responsibility is of the government. And here are some of the factors that are necessary for government to think about transplantation. Perhaps most important is this notion of prohibiting unethical transplant practice, either paid donation, trafficking, and approach to foreigners. If you come to my country, you might have a hard time getting an organ transplant depending on where you land. It's also important for the government and the legal system to certify transplant centers, to develop, again, these registries, and to develop equitable, transparent methods by which we distribute organs, because we expect people to donate their organs. They have to also be able to get organs in a specific country. Now, we divide the world up into different kinds of diseases. So there are the communicable diseases such as HIV, malaria, TB, and then there are the non-communicable diseases, and that's these chronic diseases: heart disease, liver disease, diabetes, high blood pressure, and finally trauma. The people who study death and study disease put the categories into these little buckets. So the point I want to make on this slide, if you look at the bottom, in 2006, and look at in 2000, the entire world was mainly plagued, in terms of cause of death, was mainly plagued by the communicable diseases: HIV, malaria, TB. But look now in 2016, where it's much more chronic diseases that is causing death. Now, having said that, there's no question that this delta in cause of death really depends on what your economic status is. So the next slide shows you on your left what happens in low-income countries in 2016, where still countries such as yours are fighting with communicable diseases. And then as countries become more developed and more wealthy, they are seeing more and more chronic diseases. Now, that is not to say that poor countries don't have problems with non-communicable chronic disease. They do, but they have more problems with infectious disease. And these are the most developed countries where you can see the issue is chronic diseases. So there are people in these well-developed countries, in these rich countries, who are dying of heart disease, dying of liver, dying of kidney, and they want organs. And where do they get the organs from? They get them from people who are less well off than themselves, who need money, and who are willing to sell one of their kidneys or part of their liver. And that's really the scandal and what we want to talk with you about. This is important information as well. This shows you this is all dependent on having good quality data. And you can see that in most parts of the world there's very good quality data, but from the continent of Africa there's poor data. So in many times we are guessing at what the real numbers are. So this is the data that's been generated by the World Health Organization, 56 million deaths in 2015, and look, only 11 million, and I don't mean that to dismiss it, it's a huge number, but compared to non-communicable diseases, chronic diseases, communicable diseases are quite rare, much more rare. So nearly 40 million deaths in 2015 from chronic disease. That's the pool of potential recipients. Now, the global burden of disease study actually depended on 130 countries, about 2,000 investigators, and the notion here is not just to study death, because we know that it's much more, there is death, which is obviously the end of it all, but there's also people who suffer with disease. And so a burden of disease looks at both death, but also looks at those people who lose a healthy life year, and that's called, and that's measured in DALYs. So both premature death as well as a year off your life in suffering is counted. And that gives us an even bigger number of people throughout the world who are suffering, either dying or suffering with disease. And when we do this, we actually look at risk, and that's the whole notion of the global burden disease study. And we take a look, and I don't mean to bore you with the details, but there is a certain level of risk. You have diabetes in your family, or you have metabolic syndrome, or you are overweight. Then you have a certain level of risk. If you drink alcohol in addition, or if you get hepatitis C or B in addition, your risk is much greater. And this way, the health professionals can actually figure out how to mitigate the risk in a given patient, given your baseline risk, to try to improve health. And the notion here is to do a risk assessment, communicate that risk assessment to the government, and then do something to mitigate the risk. For example, a program to eradicate hepatitis C, the programs that the WHO supports to eradicate HIV disease or malaria. It's in the same idea here that we're talking. Here is the information about DALYs. So this is death and disability from disease. And you can see again that we are missing data from Africa. So that's a major problem that really inhibits us from giving you a full picture of what the disease burden is. But look at this, the global burden of disease by region. 2.5 billion individuals either die or suffer with disease. And look at the places where disease is the most common. In light blue is sub-Saharan Africa. Above it is East Asia. Below it is South Asia. So those three places, South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and South Asia have the lion's share of the burden of disease in the world. This shows you the growing amount of non-communicable diseases relative to communicable diseases throughout the world. And this shows you the absolute number of, this is an estimate of course, of people who have various diseases, but you can see the majority of people in the world now are suffering from non-communicable disease, chronic heart failure, chronic liver failure. So on the left, I show you the reported deaths. I showed you this slide before, 56 million deaths in 2015. Let's look at the burden of kidney disease, and that's on the right-hand side. There are 1.3 million people estimated in the world who have kidney failure, but then there are another some up to 7 million people who have kidney failure but cannot afford dialysis, so they fall into the death category. There are 2 million individuals who have what's called acute kidney failure, and this most commonly are postpartum women, very commonly in Africa, who have bleeding and then develop acute kidney failure and are not supported by dialysis and die. So, in fact, there's closer to 10 million people who die every year who could benefit from a kidney transplant. And it's not just the death from kidney transplant. This shows you the burden in terms of the cost of maintaining patients on dialysis, and which cost, at least in Europe, some 70 to 80,000 euros per year. It is estimated by year 2030 that there will be 5.4 million individuals with end-stage renal disease who could benefit from dialysis, and the cost, let alone the environmental cost of doing dialysis, is enormous. 900,000 tons of plastic waste from dialysis. So these are things we have to think about. This is the global burden of liver disease. Again, we have inadequate data from Africa. But when you actually look at the global picture, what we could do in terms of transplant, the need is enormous. 10 million people who might need a kidney transplant, somewhere between 2.5 and 5 million people who might need a liver transplant. Heart may be up to 18 million people. Now, of course, many of these patients are older or have other comorbidities that would keep them from getting a transplant, but this gives you some idea of the scope of the problem. Now, I wanted to show you just a couple more slides. This slide is a comparison between the gross national product per capita and the disease burden. And this is for communicable diseases. And you can see that the African countries are all up at the top on your left-hand side. So they have a low per capita, a low GDP per capita, and a high burden of communicable diseases. Whereas in the Western countries, in the lower right, it's the reverse. So it's inversely related to your income. In contrast, when you look at chronic diseases, heart disease, liver disease, kidney disease, you can see that it is flat. It doesn't matter how rich your country is, your people will still suffer from communicable diseases. So this is a cautionary tale for us all. We all have to worry about this. And your countries will reach a stage where you will have to worry about this as well. This is a little slide showing you what we do in transplantation. In fact, in 2016, we only did 140,000 transplants, to all types of transplants. You can see the different categories there. It is estimated at that time that this represented some 10% of the global needs, but I think I've shown you that it may represent less than 1% of the global needs, really. And then finally, I just want to leave you with the thought that we do 140,000 transplants. The need for transplant, the demand, really outstrips the supply by several thousand-fold, not hundred-fold. The donors are either alive, living related or living unrelated, someone who might sell their organ, or deceased. And an inadequate supply of the deceased donors, dead donors, increasingly puts pressure on the use of live donors and has the potential for exploitation of these people. and these tend to be poor people, the most vulnerable people in our organ donors. But as legal folks, I want to leave you with the notion that the larger challenge that we all face being part of a global community really is meeting the health needs of rich and poor people who all will all suffer from end-stage organ disease. Thank you. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ascher. If anybody has a specific question right now, Dr. Ascher will be happy to answer it. Otherwise, we can, you can save it for the discussion at the end of this session. If anybody has a question right now, please raise their hands. Okay, Jennifer.
I just wanted to know, of the 140,000 transplants in 2016, are there more that happen that are simply not recorded?
Yes, and of course that's a wonderful point that you make, and certainly the ones in which people are exploited are not reported. So what is the estimate? Maybe Elmi will give you, I don't know if she has an estimate. You will? Okay, but we don't know. And of course that's incredible concern and scandal. This is what we know.
Yes, please.
D'organes, l'origine des organes qui sont mis à la disposition.
Of course, you need a surgeon for things to work right and for things to work wrong. And so there is increasingly a insistence and a demand that we make the surgeons take responsibility and learn where the organs come from. So you raise a key point that we are trying to address. But making a rule for somebody who follows the rules isn't the challenge. It's making a rule for somebody who doesn't want to follow the rules.